verdict that was given at the trial in Kenya over the 2015 Garissa attacks, which killed over 140 students. Just a reminder to you that Paris Live is broadcast Monday to Friday at 1300 GMT across our FMs in Africa. We're also streaming our audio through YouTube. And of course, you can find our podcast online, rfienglish.com. Do stay with us. Today is World Refugee Day, a campaign to raise awareness organised by the United Nations. In its annual Global Trends report, the UN Refugee Agency said a record 70.8 million people were counted at the end of 2018 as displaced from their homes. The UNHCR attributed the increase partly to surging displacement in Ethiopia, caused by interethnic conflict, and in Venezuela, where thousands are fleeing every day amid an economic collapse that has triggered shortages of basic food and medicine. Overall, the number of displaced people in the world has doubled over the last 20 years and now exceeds the population of Thailand. The trend continues to go in the wrong direction, according to the organisation. Now, more than 5 million Venezuelans have fled economic and political chaos to seek refuge abroad by the end of this year, based on the current trends so far, according to the United Nations. And the crisis is overwhelming education and health systems across South America. For more on this, I'm joined now on the line by our correspondent Emily Wright, who has been looking at the refugee crisis from Bogota in neighbouring Colombia. Emily, thank you very much for speaking to RFI today. Firstly, can you give us an overview of the situation as it stands in Venezuela according to the recent UN reports?
Yes, well, the UNHCR has recently described in their report published earlier this week as one of the biggest displacement crises in the world and the biggest exodus in the region's recent history. And Eduardo Stein, which is the UNHCR's social representative for Venezuelan refugees and migrants, has said that the crisis is unprecedented in a country that is not at war nor is suffering a major national disaster. And he has called on the international community to step up support for countries taking in those fleeing the Maduro regime. Yesterday, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, arrived in Venezuela as part of a visit to review the country's ongoing economic and political crisis. And in terms of numbers, Venezuela filed more asylum claims last year than citizens of any other country, including Syria, and more than 10% of the population has already left. And the largest group of Venezuelan refugees, roughly 1.3 million, is staying in neighbouring Colombia, which has been overwhelmed. The medical system has been overwhelmed, and border areas and big cities are feeling the pressure.
What is the public sentiment like towards the Venezuelan refugees?
Well, the Colombian government have made extraordinary efforts to accommodate the newcomers by offering health services and providing pathways to legal work. Colombian citizens' patience with Venezuelan migrants and refugees is starting to wear thin, and there has been a disturbing rise in cases of xenophobia. Last week, I spoke to a mother of 4 who had arrived in Colombia 3 months ago, and she told me that she often gets screamed at in the streets and told to go back to her own country. And many Colombians I've spoken to complain that the arrival of Venezuelan migrants is driving down wages in some industries like construction.
And how is the situation on the Colombia-Venezuela border?
Well, Colombia has recently begun to deport undocumented migrants in the border city of Cucuta. Beforehand, police and authorities used to turn a blind eye to undocumented migrants, but not anymore. And they've started to deport undocumented migrants. And in response, Venezuela now requests migration cards for Colombians traveling to Venezuela. And Colombia isn't alone in its crackdown on undocumented migrants. The volume of refugees is also overwhelming services in countries like Peru, where the government 48 hours ago installed rules that require Venezuelans to have a passport and a humanitarian visa to enter, something which is almost impossible to obtain.
And finally, earlier this week on Tuesday, a US Navy hospital ship has launched a 5-month medical assistant mission to Latin American countries who are struggling to absorb the hundreds of thousands of migrants and refugees from Venezuela. Where and when will it be stopping in Colombia?
Well, the ship departing Miami on Tuesday, aiming to help the Venezuelans in countries across Latin America, including Colombia. No exact dates have been provided at the moment for when the ship will arrive in Colombia. On Tuesday, acting U.S. Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan met with Colombian Vice President Marta Ramirez at the Pentagon to discuss Venezuela. They issued a joint statement saying that the two nations confirmed their commitment to the freedom-loving people of Venezuela, and they concluded that the US-Colombian defense relationship is stronger than ever. Now, this ship is a massive floating medical aid center with hundreds of beds and doctors and nurses, and it did come to Venezuela last November for a trip that lasted roughly a week and stopped in Turbo and Riohacha. So potentially it will stop in the same places, but nothing has yet to be confirmed.
Thank you very much for bringing us up to date with the situation there in Venezuela. That was our correspondent Emily Wright on the line from Bogota in neighbouring Colombia.
You're listening to Paris Live.
We're turning now for the theme of World Refugee Day. We'll turn now to the situation in South Africa, where there has been a rise over the past couple of years in xenophobic attacks, which the government has tried unsuccessfully to blame criminal elements for. For more on this, we cross to our Pretoria correspondent, Jean-Jacques Cornish. And due to some technical issues, we have not been able to join Jean-Jacques. We'll come back to Jean-Jacques in just a few moments. We will turn to the visit of the Chinese President Xi Jinping to North Korea. It's the first time in 14 years that a Chinese leader has visited, and it is meant to reinvigorate the ties, and it coincides with the yearly gathering of leaders of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in Bangkok, known as ASEAN. RFI's Jan van der Merwe talked to Michael Dillon, who is an independent China researcher and author of A Modern History of China, about North Korea's sometimes unpredictable relations with Beijing.
Relations between North Korea and China have been up and down over the years, and they've been very, very strained recently. North Korea has been trying to act independently, has been developing its nuclear weapons far further than China would want. Also, Kim Jong-un has been having direct talks with President Trump and also with the South Korean president. So in many ways, China has been left out of the equation, which is rather strange, given that the North Koreans relied very, very heavily on China, particularly for food supplies when the famines have been very, very bad. So it looks as if Xi Jinping is trying to reassert his position now and reassert the importance of China in North Korea's international relations.
In the old days when Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current leader, was in charge, he had this policy of playing China against the Soviet Union rather successfully. You have the feeling that Kim Jong-un is now doing the same with China and the United States?
Not only China and the United States, but also China and Russia. China and Russia have been getting closer together since both of them have been having rather tricky relations with the United States. The North Koreans, in many ways, have also always been playing off both sides against the middle. And this has always irritated the Chinese authorities, who felt that they were being messed about when they were giving aid to a struggling country.
The visit of Xi Jinping to North Korea and the strengthening of these ties, as you described them, coincides with the ASEAN meeting, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in Bangkok. ASEAN was initially created as a counterweight against the growing Chinese power. Is it a coincidence that China is now cozying up to North Korea again?
China has got to try and build its relationships with ASEAN, because a lot of the ASEAN countries are directly involved in the One Belt, One Road project. And I think China is looking more broadly at its international relations. It's not at all clear whether China has been trying to arrange a visit of President Xi to North Korea and it's been rejected, or whether they've just been leaving North Korea to go on in their own way. But it's not really surprising that Xi Jinping wants to reassert himself at this time.
Talking about ASEAN, how does the dynamic of that organization play in the current trade spat between the United States and China?
China is saying that it's not suffering very much from the trade rift with the United States. Slightly difficult to be sure whether that's true, but equally they are hedging their bet by trying to get better trading relations or more investing relations with countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, which are in their sights for the Belt and Road project.
Now, Vietnam is one of the key members of ASEAN. It seemed to be cozying up to the United States in spite of their history of warfare in the 70s. But will it become a US stronghold against China?
Vietnam is a special case. Vietnam was, in theory, close to China during the 60s and 70s. But then, of course, China invaded Vietnam in 1979. Vietnam, of course, having been close to the former Soviet Union. Independent Vietnam since the 70s has been determined to develop its own economic policies independent of China, which historically always had claims on part of Vietnam, although in many ways the Vietnamese economic model has followed the Chinese. The Vietnamese, like all other Southeast Asian countries, are trying to attract Chinese investment, which everybody wants. Everybody wants at the moment China to be their rich uncle of China, and it's rather a difficult tightrope to walk.
There was Michael Dillon, an independent China researcher, speaking to RFI's Jan van der Maden.
Correspondence Call.
Coming back to our theme of World Refugee Day, we turn to the situation in South Africa, where there's been a rise in xenophobic attacks, which the government has tried to blame on criminal elements. For more on this, we turn to our Pretoria correspondent, Jean-Jacques Cornish. Jean-Jacques, thank you very much for speaking to RFI today. Now, firstly, where does South Africa rank as a host to refugees, and where do most of them come from?
Well, South Africa ranks behind Ethiopia, Uganda, Sudan, and Kenya, but it's very much a magnet for refugees as the largest economy on the continent. Well, some say Nigeria is, so we vie with Nigeria for that one. But they come from Mozambique and Zimbabwe, our neighboring states to the east and north, and from the DRC, many from the DRC, and many from Nigeria. But, you know, they also come from Rwanda, Cameroon, Uganda. I'm in touch daily with people from those countries. For a Rwandan, for example, who came and stood and said, you're somebody in the street, I'm told, that speaks French. Can you help me? And this man had walked to South Africa from Rwanda back at the time of the genocide, it has to be said. But they are ostracized. They don't speak Zulu, Sotho, Xhosa, the major local languages. And as a result of that, you know, they are put aside and they referred to in local slang as makwerekwere, which is a slightly pejorative term for foreigner.
And Jean-Jacques, why is there such enmity towards foreigners in South Africa?
Well, South Africa is a developing country. We have 25% unemployment, and when you look at youth unemployment, that way exceeds 30%. And we're hearing today that President Cyril Ramaphosa in his State of the Nation address is addressing jobs, poverty, service deliveries, the major things bothering South Africans. And the perception is that the foreigners are taking the jobs and using up those services. And many, the perception is, are not refugees, but economic migrants. That's not unlike, of course, the perception in some European countries. Nigerians are blamed for a lot of the crime in South Africa. So we've had this xenophobic violence back in 2008. More than 60 people died. And again, we've had incidents in 2015, 2017, last year, and this year. The then Foreign Minister, Lindiwe Sisulu, called an urgent meeting of ambassadors from those people affected by this violence against foreigners. A special committee was set up, but we've still to see exactly what it's going to do. Many other committees have been set up and they haven't really met with much success. The fact is, Africans particularly are faced with hunger at home or danger here in South Africa, are prepared to take their chances in South Africa.
And now South Africa is acknowledged to have excellent legislation dealing with refugees and asylum seekers, but why is it not able to implement it?
Well, for a start, the corruption on asylum seekers that has become endemic has to be rooted out. We have a lack of capacity in South Africa. There's also a lack of knowledge of the rights of refugees. And the refugee reception offices are very largely inaccessible. So in some cases, people have to travel from Cape Town 1,600 kilometers to Johannesburg or Pretoria every 6 months to have their cases looked at. There's a disparity between the written rights of refugees and asylum seekers and the poor legislative implementation of those rights. You know, we're a country receiving a large number of refugees, and we need to have better oversight of the procedure and rights that these people have. You know, for example, refugees, well, they'll get to school, the children, 1 in 2 refugees are, of course, children, and they'll get to school, but they have no access to the bursaries that all South Africans need in order to have the tertiary education and develop themselves and prepare themselves for the 21st century.
Thank you very much for joining us on the programme on that subject of World Refugee Day. That was our correspondent in Pretoria, Jean-Jacques Cornish. Now for something completely different. There's more trouble for the French nuclear sector, EDF. Yesterday, we learnt that huge stretches of the Loire River are contaminated with a radioactive substance called tritium, probably because of leaks from one or all of the 5 reactors which line the river. And that's not good news, but there's even worse, as our press reviewer Michael Fitzpatrick is about to tell us.
Thanks, Olia. Today's story concerns the pressurised water reactor which is being built by the French national electricity supplier EDF at Flamanville on the Channel coast. This project, which is supposed to represent the future of nuclear energy, is already so far over budget and so far behind schedule that it makes the Egyptian pyramids look like they sprang up overnight. Le Monde starts its article on the latest setback by asking, will the agony of Flamanville ever end? The latest problem in a litany longer than Tolstoy's War and Peace has been provoked by safety inspectors who, God forgive them, have discovered that there are flaws in the welding of the tubes which get the steam from the nuclear boiler to the turbines. There are 58 joints in question, including 8 that are so deeply buried in the concrete foundations of the huge structure that if the inspectors insist on getting them fixed, the entire site will effectively be returned to the starting point. The electricity chappies have suggested that those 8 joints could perhaps be overlooked.
So, joking apart, Michael, it all sounds a little bit approximate. We are, after all, talking about nuclear safety, and that's a serious concern.
Indeed, but it looks as if the electricity company has been making life difficult for itself, because this was to be the global showcase project. EDF engineers decided to insist on the very highest quality standards, so they set the bar very high for themselves. But not all the suppliers have been able to meet the norms demanded, and that seems to be the case this time around, even if some of the troubled wells are, according to the newspapers, not even up to basic standards. In fact, says Le Monde, EDF engineers have already suggested to the safety inspectors that all 58 dubious joints could be left as they are until they get the whole business bubbling away, with a view to patching them up sometime in 2024. But even that, which doesn't sound like a great solution, would delay the launch date until 2022, 10 years later than the original promise, and would push costs beyond the current estimate of 11 billion euros, which is well over 3 times the starting budget.
Now, is there any danger that they might pull the plug on the whole operation?
Apparently, yes, and this for the first time. According to Le Monde, the possibility raises its ugly head that EDF might actually have to close down the site and put the key under the door. The centrist paper says abandoning the project at this late stage would be a disaster for the French electricity company, which had been hoping to sell the technology showcased at Flamanville all over the world, to say nothing of the billions of euros which have already been wasted on this huge building site. That decision, I stress, has not yet been taken. There's to be a meeting of top EDF management over the next few days to consider the options.
And finally, Michael, are there real options?
Well, the nuclear watchdog, WOOF, is not asking the impossible. They say huge progress has been made on safety at the site and that the required repairs are technically feasible without going back to the very beginning of the site. The government will have an acute interest in the outcome, especially since President Emmanuel Macron had been hoping hoping that the rest of France's ageing reactors would have been replaced with Flamanville-style gizmos. No new reactors will now be built in France before the next presidential election, which is due in 2022, which means that the planned closure of the country's 4 remaining coal-fired power stations, which were supposed to be shut down during this Macron presidency, might have to be pushed back by, well, a day or two. And that will be sure to make the Green contingent see red.
Indeed. Thank you very much to Michael Fitzpatrick there.
In Focus.
The long wait is over. Kenyan judges have finally delivered their verdict on the 2015 attack on Garissa University. In an eagerly anticipated ruling, judges convicted Rashid Charles Mbersero, Mohammed Ali Abikar and Hassan Idin Hassan of conspiracy to commit the attack, in which 4 gunmen killed 148 people, mainly students. A 4th man, Sahal Diriye Hussein, was acquitted of the charges. All 4 men are Kenyan nationals, except Rashid Charles Mbersero, who is Tanzanian. The judgment came after 4 years and has already sparked mixed reactions, as RFI's Christina Okello, who joins me now, will tell us.
Yes, Olia, well, the long wait appears to have been worth it, because after 4 years, Kenyans got the conviction they were hoping for, even if one of the suspects was acquitted. Of course, we still need to wait for the final sentencing on the 3rd of July, but it does appear that the 3 suspects, Mbersero, Abika and Hassan, will be spending the rest of their lives behind bars. And this conviction is really a victory for the Kenyan police and prosecutors, who have constantly been accused of botching up high-profile cases in the past. There was this incident back in 2010 following the elections where a police officer was shot dead, a protester, during the violence that ensued afterwards, and yet managed to get off scot-free because the gun that was presented in court as evidence had a different serial number to the one he actually used. And flaws like this have really been criticised and blamed for the reason why so many terror suspects have gotten off in the past scot-free. But this pattern today appears to be changing. For Dennis Owino, a political analyst with the think tank Kenya Insights, Wednesday's conviction marks the end of impunity.
For me, it's a good news given the fact that, this is one of the biggest attacks that ever hit Kenya in the terrorism history that we've been trying to deal with in the recent past. So it for at least to find to hold accountable the suspects, to hold accountable the people that were involved in this heinous act that robbed us a good number of young people, So it was a judgment that so many people were looking up to, given the fact that previously not so many terror acts we've been able to hold people accountable.
And the worst of the attacks in Nairobi took place in 2013 at the Westgate Mall that killed 67 people. However, no one was ever held accountable, which fueled resentment against the judiciary. This sentiment was further sharpened after an attack on a hotel complex in January this year, which came a day after the terror suspects involved in the Westgate attack were acquitted. And this loss of life was the latest in a long episode of Kenya's war with al-Shabaab militants.
And it's a war which today is increasingly being called into question.
Yes, that's right. Dennis Owino asks whether the human cost is worth it.
Time for Kenya to move away from the war from Somalia, because we need to look into what do we stand to lose or to win from our forces staying in there. It's also a thing, because all these attacks, for them, the al-Shabaab, they're saying, we need you to move out from our country. We need you to go back. That is has been their main agenda. I think a good number of people are on the opinion that our forces should be pulled away, because Kenya has become the biggest victim on the war of terror. We have an AMISOM that's now the force that is fighting al-Shabaab. But it's not only Kenya that was in Somalia. We have the East African community. They've sent their soldiers there. They've sent their forces there. But at the end of the day, it's always Kenya who is the biggest victim of all. Nobody is happy about losing anyone. Nobody is enjoying about the terror attacks that is happening. So it has been something for a good time we've always been vouching and we've all been asking.
And Christina, why is Kenya a target for Al-Shabaab?
Well, the group has repeatedly threatened retaliation attacks as long as Kenyan forces remain in Somalia. And just to remind listeners, Nairobi intervened in Mogadishu back in 2011 after constant cross-border attacks by militants in the north of the country that often targeted Western tourists. Basically, terrorism was bad for business and Kenya wanted to put a stop to it. Yet despite the 8 years the country has been at war with Somalia, Al-Shabaab has continued to strike and cause bloodshed on Kenyan soil. Al-Shabaab prioritizes Kenya over Ethiopia and other Eastern African states as a target primarily for PR purposes. Kenya has high international visibility, and so any attack will automatically get maximum coverage, and this means maximum propaganda for the group.
So should Kenya simply walk away from Somalia?
Well, some experts argue that Al-Shabaab attacked Nairobi multiple times even before Kenyan troops entered the country, and that the government would be best advised in tightening its porous border with Somalia and in stepping up its fight against Al-Shabaab. The question, though, is can Kenyans be patient, and how long can Kenyan troops go on battling Al-Shabaab militants? The conviction of these three men then on Wednesday may be good news for Kenya's justice system, but sadly it doesn't solve the bigger question about Kenya's future role in Somalia.
Thank you very much to Christina Okello there.
Focus on Africa.
In today's Focus on Africa, we go to Liberia, where allegations of sexual harassment and abuse against two of the Catholic Church's top leaders continue to traumatise the lives of spiritual workers, while Christians look to the skies for divine intervention to resolve the most damaging scandal to have hit the faith in decades. RFI's William Niebuhr has more.
The scandal broke out in August last year when estranged Reverend Father Gabriel Sawyer sent an email to the Pope accusing the Archbishop of Monrovia and another top bishop of persecuting him and other subordinates who refused to have sex with him. Reverend Father Gabriel Sawyer, who has since resigned, claims that the psychological and mental molestations were too much for him to continue with his spiritual mission. Bai Best is the editor of the Liberian Observer newspaper. He's just published an insight column about the Roman Catholic Church remaining under siege.
It appears to be confirming a lot of long-running secrets attributed to the Catholic Church, especially in Liberia, for a long time. We've always heard about priests that have been either sexually involved with young men or with young women. And because they were priests, it appears to be that they saw it as a good cover, as a perfect cover for promiscuity. But these are all allegations. They have yet to be proven, except that this is now one person's account having been reported at the highest level of the Catholic Church in the world. I think so far it has been a rather quiet response, and one of the things about scandals in Liberia is that one of the best ways that the powers that be tend to deal with scandals is that they just remain quiet and let the dust blow over. And hopefully the public will find new scandals to take the place of the old ones, and things will just move along.
Bai Best, editor of the Liberian Observer newspaper on the line from Monrovia. Alfonso Towe is the publisher of New Republic online newspaper in Monrovia. I asked him what had filtered in from the Vatican about the complaint Father Sawyer filed against the Archbishop.
People are looking at it to be very serious, and as a matter of fact, local journalists pick up the issue and publish some excerpts from the letter. That drew a lot of attention in the church itself. And the Knight of St. John, which is a very unique body in the church, was not happy with what came out, so they expelled this journalist. But actually, the Catholic Church in Liberia decided to conduct an investigation already because they think that such news coming out doesn't speak well of the church.
This Archbishop, is he a controversial figure?
No, fortunately not. I mean, Archbishop Ziegler is a very quiet person. That's the difference between he and his predecessor, Archbishop Michael Bakala Francis. Francis was very charismatic. I mean, he could challenge people head on.
I understand that the influential Liberian community in the United States, which has expressed outrage about the harrowing affair, has been piling pressure on Monsignor Ziegler to step down. What do you make of the swelling rumors there in Monrovia that he's about to take early retirement and that he will probably be replaced by Bishop Andrew Conley of Cape Palmas?
Those in the diaspora have some level of influence in the country. And Archbishop Ziegler is an old person, and Andrew Conley is younger. So probably He has decided to go in early retirement, and then coincidentally, this incident occurred.
And Reverend Gabriel Sawyer himself, who reported Archbishop Ziegler to the Pope, has since resigned and gone into exile in the United States. He left the country claiming to be the first person to speak out about widespread homosexuality and abuse of children by clergymen for years. Do you know if it was due to any threats to his life that he finally decided to resign and leave the country?
I don't think his life was on a threat. What I've been able to establish from some Catholics here is that there have been some problems with he and Archbishop for some time because some of the parishes he went, he could not account for some financial transactions that went on there. And some years back, the Archbishop called upon him to preach. And then, out of sudden, he switched around and began to speak against the Archbishop in his presence. So which made many Catholics who attended the ceremony at the time baffled. And so from that point onward, he was like transferred from one place to another. So it could be that risk might have increased to a considerable level that maybe he could not stand.
There's been some speculation going on there in Monrovia that he actually created these allegations against the bishops as an excuse to leave the priesthood.
That's what some Catholics who maybe have beef with him are saying. But I remember in some of the Catholic churches around here, some priests who expressed complete dissatisfaction over his allegation and said, well, Father Sawyer was not even a clean person. He was involved in so many things, dubious acts. So why should we come out now? So he's trying to find a escape route to leave and then bring this huge allegation against the Archbishop.
I understand Father Sawyer has been in the middle of a media frenzy in Monrovia also about an open romantic relationship he enjoyed with a Liberian woman even before his resignation.
That I can't prove.
Is this an isolated incident, or have there been previous occasions where priests have complained about other sorts of harassment by superiors in the church?
What has been happening here is that some seminarians, people who studied to become priests, have come out in some quarters to say we have been put out because the bishop does not favor us. There are some of them that have been in the seminary for 5 years, and at the last moment of their ordination, they were turned down by the Archbishop because someone from somewhere have come with allegation that, well, you have a child or you've done things that are not in line with your religious responsibility, religious duties, so therefore you cannot be ordained. So actually, yes, indeed, these things are big one, but for this sexual aspect of it, it's the first time that a priest is coming on to actually point at Archbishop Ziegler.
This scandal is bound to have a destabilizing effect on Liberian Christians, especially at these times when faith has become a solid refuge to millions hit by severe hardships resulting from the long civil war and the recent Ebola epidemic.
Yes, it's a hard time now here, but it's also a time, if you are a true Christian, if you are a true follower of Christ, this is the time to come closer to Christ, to ask for direction of the church, to ask for forgiveness, to seek for God's intervention. Is a time that Christians need to be prayerful and meditate and wait around so that they can have a good direction and move forward.
Alfonso Towe, publisher of the New Republic newspaper, on the line from Monrovia. Thank you so much for speaking to Radio France International.
You're welcome, William.
That was Focus on Africa with William Niebuhr.
What's the name of the man who founded the Falun Dafa meditation movement? Listen to the Sound Kitchen podcast this Saturday and see if you're one of the lucky winners. And tease your brain with the new quiz question. That's the Sound Kitchen podcast, ready for you every Saturday on the RFI English website, rfienglish.com, or wherever you get your podcasts.
You can follow RFI English on Facebook and Twitter, and email us at parislive@rfi.fr.
Follow all the excitement of the 32nd Cup of African Nations right here on Paris Live.
Yes, that means it's time for men's football news, and Paul Myers joins me live from Cairo, where he's going to be covering the Africa Cup of Nations. But before we get to that, we're going to have a look at a little bit of men's football in South America too, Paul.
Yes, earlier, because it's the Copa America going on there in Group B. Colombia qualified for the last 8 following a 1-0 win over Qatar. And Argentina had that man Lionel Messi to thank. He scored from the penalty spot in the 1-1 draw with Paraguay. And that was after Richard Sanchez put Paraguay ahead just before half-time. And actually, just before we head to the football, we mustn't forget the World Cup in cricket, where New Zealand beat South Africa by 4 wickets yesterday to go top of the table and seal a place in the last 4. South Africa, though, earlier aren't looking that good. They're in 7th place. That's 10 teams in the table. And South Africa have played 6 of their 9 matches, so I don't think we'll be seeing the South Africans in the semi-finals.
And now to Egypt and the football going on there. But firstly, an administrative thing has cropped up. The head of the games ruling body has called for help. Is that right?
Yes. Ahmed Ahmad, the president of the Confederation of African Football, has called in the World Games ruling body, FIFA, to assist him in his plans for reform. Now, Fatma Samura, who's Secretary General at FIFA, that's effectively the number 2, will go into CAF for 6 months from August to look at what does and doesn't work in the organisation. Let's call it an audit. And by simple imagination, she'll look at how CAF's competitions can be run more efficiently and how CAF polices itself. And if she feels that she needs longer to do all this, she'll be able to stay on, provided both CAF and FIFA agree. Now, Ahmed says that FIFA are good at cleaning things up. There'll be quite a few people who say that's not the case, but he says it was his idea to get things done in CAF, but actually, earlier, it's an extraordinary move. It's crying for help from Big Daddy, and you could imagine just the furore there would people at the European Games ruling body UEFA did something like this, and also to announce it on the eve of the continent's showcase event, the Africa Cup of Nations, which of course has been expanded to 24 teams this year.
So, well, if Ahmed says CAF needs help to sort itself out, why is it expanding a tournament that was already quite successful as a 16-team event?
Yeah. Well, it's actually rather like moving into a bigger, more expensive house when you've just lost your job and you've got no means of paying for it. Ahmed, he's got a point here. He says that the Cup of Nations has to expand to allow the smaller teams a moment in the limelight, and he says it's all part of inspiring children in all corners of Africa to feel that they too can one day show off their skills at the tournament. And it's not just about the kids in Nigeria or Ghana or Senegal or Morocco thinking that that's possible for them. It's about the children in Mauritania, for example, or even in Burundi. And this is the thing that he's managed to be very convincing about, because Burundi, Madagascar and Mauritania will be taking part in the 2019 Africa Cup of Nations for the very first time due to that expansion. Now, the other side of the coin is that Egypt, one of the big countries in African football, is hosting the event for the 5th time. Mo Salah, just fresh from another extraordinary season with Liverpool, well, he's the poster boy of the entire place, and the Pharaohs, as strangely they're called and nicknamed, are feeling pretty confident with him.
And finally, Paul, what's the build-up been like? I mean, what's the atmosphere like?
Well, it's hot, and I'm talking about the atmosphere and also the temperatures. Everybody is really excited about it. Everybody's fantastically excited about it. As I say, they've got Salah. He's the poster boy. He's on all the big advertisements leading into Cairo and to all the other cities hosting the games. That's up in Ismailia and also Alexandria and Suez. And there's so much excitement. You go into a shop and people ask you, who do you want to support? And they all gather around you and you feel quite intimidated and you have to say something like Egypt, and that makes everybody smile. It's really wonderful, very welcoming, and everyone's really looking forward to it.
Well, have fun, and we'll be talking to you tomorrow about what's been happening there in Egypt. Thank you very much to Paul Myers covering the Africa Cup of Nations.
International Report.
In Mexico, the scope of violence against women is particularly wide. It goes from unsolicited catcalling to socially accepted harassment to increasing levels of femicides. In March, hundreds of women took to social media to report the many abuses they have suffered under the #MeToo hashtag. But the suicide of a rock star after accusations were made against him complicated everything. Correspondent Alex Hardy followed the case in this final report of a 4-part series on women in Mexico.
When Ana Gonzalez, a 29-year-old Mexican and dedicated Twitter user, posted an exasperated tweet one afternoon in late March, she had no idea what she was about to unleash. She had grown fed up of hearing from friends about how the up-and-coming Mexican writer Gerson Barrona was behaving with women.
Here is the story. A powerful man in the literary sphere has beaten up, manipulated, gaslighted, impregnated and abandoned more than 10 women. But since he is a famous writer, no one believes these women.
Next thing she knew, the Mexican Twitter sphere was submerged with an outpouring of women, reporting a wide range of abuses in various sectors: advertising, journalism, cinema, literature, academics. Eloisa Ferreira is one of them. She worked for more than 10 years as the international news editor at Mexico's most famous newspaper, Reforma. She also had to cope with the lustful boss, she says.
It was 3 years of harassment. He invited me to go out, tried to make me drink, touched my thigh, tried to kiss me, despite my constant rejections. Once he rubbed his genitals against my leg, and that made me realise what this was all about and everything I'd been through and how I'd minimised it because I didn't know what to call it.
Ferreira went to every possible work authority to have her case addressed, but it got her nowhere.
The #MeToo hashtag appears and I decide to make my case public to see what happens. And the response is immediate. In less than 48 hours, this managing editor is laid off. That was the most surprising part. The public eye was more effective than any institutional remedy I'd tried.
As the #MeToo movement grew stronger and some names kept appearing over and over on Twitter, several high-ranking men were laid off or suspended while internal investigations were conducted.
It surprised me. Although the movement was muted for a long time, it finally came through. Women journalists who'd been working for 30 years came to me and said, finally, someone is talking about it. It's a culture of machismo and impunity. What I've been through embodies what's happening in Mexico.
A week after the #MeToo movement started, Mexican rock star Armando Vega Gil, who was mentioned in anonymous reports of child harassment, committed suicide. The tragic event had a chilling effect on the movement. A lot of people started wondering, is Twitter really the best place to report abuse? How can one be sure the testimonies are true? It might not be the best way, but currently it seems like the only one, Ferreira asserts.
It's not the best way. In the best case scenario, we'd all be using the institutional path. But what my case has shown in particular is that institutions are not effective. So yes, I understand people who make denunciations anonymously, although it does have its risks too.
Irene, that's not her real name, agreed to talk on the phone. She reported her aggressor under the #MeToo hashtag anonymously because she fears retaliation. He is her teacher and still owes her documents which she needs to validate her diploma. According to her, whatever the path a woman chooses to speak up, she will be criticized.
When you decide to stand up and report to the authorities, they start asking, but why did you dress like this? Were you drunk? Why did you go out so late? You probably pissed him off. So you think, very well, I'll just make an anonymous statement on social media. And then people go, no, it doesn't work like this. Just stand up for yourself and have the guts to report it to the authorities. As a result, all the spaces to report abuses become inoperable.
For feminist lawyer Andrea Medina, Vega Gil's gesture was a turning point.
This musician's suicide was a real watershed in Mexico. Authorities observed such a resounding silence that it made me fear we were going to lose all of the progress we'd made in the last few decades. It's not about whether we believe these women or not. It's about authorities investigating their claims. I think that's our main challenge. Stop thinking that gender violence is something that can be settled in private in the shadows and acknowledge that it's a public issue.
For the past months, she's been compiling testimonies to expose the various patterns of gender violence, something she says authorities should be doing.
The authorities said that they couldn't investigate any report that hadn't been filed with them. But no, they can investigate of their own initiative without putting the burden of proof on victims. One example, 600 reports in the advertising industry. It was more than enough for the Labour Secretary to pay attention and to organise a roundtable meeting to see what was going on. Nothing was done.
President López Obrador did address the movement several days after it started. That's a problem for the Women's Institute to attend, he said, which further angered those who have been trying to establish that gender violence is a societal issue. For Radio France International, I'm Alex Hardy, reporting from Mexico City.
Live on Live.
Paris Live's special guest today is Olivier Kuhlmann, photographer and curator of an exhibition on the ubiquitous selfie in the Portraits Festival, which is currently on in Vichy in the centre of France. The studies of human nature by 8 photographers are on show. Kuhlmann's exhibition is an eye-opener onto the incredible range of subject matter and purpose of the selfie. He spoke to RFI's Roslyn Hyams.
Olivier Kuhlmann, welcome.
Thank you.
You've curated one of the exhibitions that's in this year's Portrait singular and plural, Portrait and Portraits annual festival of portrait photography in Vichy in the centre of France. Yours is called Selfies and subheaded in French ego/ego, which is ego/equals in English. Why did you choose this heading, this title for your exhibition?
Okay, the first idea for almost everybody about selfies is that it's egocentric way of doing photography. And I discovered by doing this curation that the selfie is also a way of doing photography which is more equal for almost all the people around the world who have a cell phone, because most of the selfies are done with cell phones. So I decided to put this title, which is, of course, play on words. But it's important for me to understand that the selfie is not just an ego way of doing photography, but also something which is more possible for everyone.
What's your take on the selfie today? Is there a photographer's view on this? One of the 20 series in the exhibition in Vichy is actually showing you, it's selfies you've taken of yourself. You're wearing a wig. It's not that easy to recognize you.
Yes, sure. It's the series that I have done in 2014 in Seoul, in Korea, in South Korea. I was wondering at this time why suddenly the camera, which was like our eyes from ourselves to the others, suddenly it's reversed. So it suddenly was to ourselves and not to the others. And I was questioning myself a lot about this change, which is like a revolution in the history of photography. And when I was there, a lot of people were doing selfies, and it was the beginning of the sticks for selfies, and you could buy them everywhere. And so I decided to make some kind of visit of Seoul through this way of doing photography, this selfies way of doing photography. And so I put black glasses and, I changed myself a little bit to be someone else. But that was the beginning of my questioning about selfies.
What did you learn from that experience? You say that was where you began your research into this whole selfie fashion, the whole sort of selfie concept.
I would say that I learned much more recently, because I started this curation in December, so it was only 6 months of doing this, and I learned a lot about selfies more recently than when I have done this series in Korea. And I one more time discovered how interesting it was, because I always think about what will stay for the future with photography. I mean, if in 1 century or 2 centuries, the people want to understand the beginning of the years 2000, the selfies, I think, will be maybe more interesting than all the other photography which are done like for newspaper, magazine, by professional photographers to understand our way of living today. And that's why also I wanted to dive into this world of selfies, which is huge. I mean, it's the biggest production of photography today. The category of photography in which the people are doing a lot of photographies every day.
In fact, your range of 24 series covers a lot of ground, but obviously it can't cover every type of selfie that's out there or that's being done today. How did you go about choosing which ones? Was it to do with the quality of the selfie itself, of the photographer, or was it to have a range? How did you do this?
It was more about having a range, because the quality of selfies is not really important. And for me, it's not the point. What was interesting was to understand the selfies that we know. I mean, like the politics selfies or the selfies in front of monument, like touristic selfies, but also to try to see other categories which are maybe less well known than the others. So for the categories like touristic monuments, for example, I decided to choose one monument, which is the Eiffel Tower, which is the monument in front of which people are doing the most selfies than any other monument.
Not just because it was in France.
No. I don't know. It's because it's the Eiffel Tower and a lot of tourists are going there. But it was not because it was in France. It was because it was the most important monument for selfies. And like for politics, I decided to choose this selfie that Emmanuel Macron, the French president, has done in front of his group of people who helped him to become a president 3 days before being elected. And this selfies has been changed and transformed by many people on internet, and so I choose this one specifically and show how it was changed and with a lot of joke that people are doing. And for other categories, it was very more specific, and that some of those categories are not very well known.
You say there's the political ones like the Emmanuel Macron being used in different collage and montage. There's another one that talks about the relationship between homeless people and people who do have homes. It's very disturbing.
It's a very strange category. Most of those pictures were done in Russia. And it's mostly young people and wealthy people who are doing, and maybe they are drunk when they are doing that, I don't know, but who are doing selfies in front of homeless. So it's like in the subway or in the streets, and most of them are smiling. There are 1, 2, or 3 of them, and on the back of the selfie you can see the homeless most of the time sleeping, lying on the floor, and it's really terrible. It's probably the worst series in the exhibition.
There's another series that's interesting that also shows a disaster waiting to happen, Poubella.
This series in the exhibition is from Tunisia to make the government react with the rubbish.
We see piles
of
it.
Yeah. So the people of the cities decided to make selfies in front of this the poubellas on the floor to send them on website to the government to make them react and to make them doing something about it. So this is more political.
And this is selfie as a campaign.
Yeah, exactly. they use it as a tool, and those two series are close in the exhibition because one is really terrible and the other one is very useful. I mean, selfie can be used in the most terrible way, and it can be used in a very useful way.
You also have a series of photos where you've set up a studio in India where people often go individually or as families to have their photos taken against very elaborate and decorative backdrops. And you disguise yourself to become lots of different Indians.
First of all, I want to make a difference between self-portraits and selfies, because this previous series that I have done, which is called The Others in India, was more self-portraits. The selfies, the definition of selfies is that first you are doing yourself the pictures with your hand, with the camera turning to you, or off part of your body, like your feet, for example, or in the mirror. That's mostly the three categories in selfies, or with the stick. And the self-portrait is different, and you can find self-portraits in all the history of photography. The name selfies was given in 2002 by an Australian guy who photographed his mouth because he was drunk the previous night and he hurt his mouth, and he sent these pictures to some website of doctors to ask them if it was a problem. And he used this word selfie. So for this exhibition, I really wanted to show selfies and not self-portraits. And the exhibition is not only about selfies, it's an exhibition of selfies. I mean, I show only selfies. So I didn't go before 2002.
Olivier Kuhlmann, thank you very much for speaking to us today.
Thank you so much.
We wish you all the very best with this exhibition, Selfies, Ego, Ego.
Thank you.
And that interview was recorded by RFI's Rosalind Hyams.
We have food and wine, of course.
And strikes and protests.
There's art and haute couture.
And those stripy t-shirts.
But it's so much more.
And we want to tell you about it.
If you're interested in France, let us be your ears and eyes on the ground.
We'll take you beyond the baguette to hear from the people who make France what it is.
And who want to change it.
To give you a fuller picture of this country at the heart of Europe. Find us on Spotlight on France,
a weekly podcast from Radio France International on rfienglish.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Time to wrap up Paris Live with a quick look at what's been happening on the RFI website. And I'm joined in the studio now by Angela Diffley. And it seems that we're beginning with the story today, which is about blood donors. And there's a little bit of a controversy going on. Tell us about that, Angela.
Yes, gay rights activists have announced today that they have lodged a complaint with the European Commission over a French ban on blood donations by gay men unless they abstain from sex for a year beforehand. And they announced that today. The situation was that until July 2016, gay and bisexual men were not allowed to donate blood at all in France under a ban introduced in 1983. And that was changed in 2015, and a new rule was put in place saying that in July 2016, saying that gay and bisexual men could donate, but only if they abstained from sex for 12 months beforehand. Now, there is a particular context in France to anything to do with blood donations. There was a very famous situation where hundreds of people died in the 1980s after HIV-tainted blood was distributed by the National Blood Transfusion Centre. That led to resignations and went to a very high level. It's a very sensitive issue in France, this issue of blood donating and the safety of blood samples. This complaint which has been lodged is by a man who identifies himself only as Maxime. He says earlier this month he went to give blood at a centre on the outskirts of Paris, and he told staff taking his details that he'd been in a relationship for 18 months. And he says the doctor told him that was problematic, that he couldn't give blood, but that he could make a plasma donation instead. And he says he felt very humiliated. And the head of the French National Blood Donation Service, Stéphane Noël, says it's understandable that any prospective donor should be disappointed not to be able to give blood, but he says the staff are trained to explain with sensitivity and respect what it is that leads us to refuse such donors, he says. So we'll see how this court hearing progresses. There is already one at the European Court of Human Rights. The president of AIDS, which is a prominent AIDS charity here in France, says giving blood is not a right, it's a duty. And we'll see where this leads. It's a controversial issue. And we'll be following it here on RFI. We have a story on that on our website today.
Thank you very much to Angela Diffley. That's all we have time for Paris Live. Join us again tomorrow, 1300 hours GMT. For now, goodbye and thanks for listening.